The song Plastic Love was originally released in 1984 by Japanese singer Maria Takeuchi, emerging as part of the city pop genre, but not seeing great success at the time. 33 years later, a fan-made extended mix of the song was posted to YouTube by the user Plastic Lover. When I wrote this paper in December last year, the video had a little over 48 million views, but today that number is 56 million views and climbing. As we can see here, there's a trend throughout the comments section of English-speaking users expressing nostalgic sentiment, most of them admitting that they have neither lived in Japan nor were they alive in the 1980s. Although they have no reason to feel traditional nostalgia, they seem instead to be experiencing what Michael D. Dwyer defines as pop nostalgia, an effective response to cultural texts that draws on tropes, symbols, or styles referring to a particular time period. While the song seems incredibly popular among English-speaking online audiences, it's apparently not seen the same resurgence in Japan, nor is it remembered very fondly. It's instead seen as a kind of cheesy corporate genre, much like we see Muzak in North America. So what exactly is it that makes this song so incredibly popular with Western audiences on YouTube? How does this invoke nostalgic affect with audiences who have no direct experience with the 1980s? My paper seeks to examine this by comparing a similar rise in pop nostalgia, the 50s revival of the 1970s. According to Philip Auslander, the 50s revival started as early as 1968 and continued throughout the 1970s and 80s. Pop culture saw a rising trend of 1950s nostalgia in its media. TV shows like Happy Days and films like Grease were immensely popular, and musicians borrowed from, or returned to, rock and roll of the 1950s. Elton John's Crocodile Rock, released in 1973, exploited this cultural craving for pop nostalgia. John Lennon released the album Rock and Roll in 1975, exploring his own artistic roots in classic rock and roll. And Chuck Berry himself even earned his first #1 hit in both the UK and the US with a live performance cover of a novelty song recorded originally in 1952. In comparison to today, we see a similar nostalgic taste for 1980s media in films like Ready Player One, TV shows like Stranger Things or Glow, and popular music that references and imitates the sound and aesthetic of 1980s pop music. Through social media trends, music from that era is also revived and rediscovered. For instance, the 1983 song Break My Stride returned to the charts in 2020 after going viral on TikTok. A number of scholars have examined the 50s revival and have formulated their own opinions on why rising trends of pop nostalgia are relevant. The three particular scholars that I discuss include Daniel Marcus, who argues that romanticization of the ideal 1950s society was used in direct service of rising conservative politics leading up to and continuing throughout the Reagan era. Philip Auslander, who views particular performances of 1950s rock and roll in the 1970s as a kind of reprieve from the countercultural and political nature of post-60s rock music. And Michael D. Dwyer, who discusses nostalgia as an effective response to a sense of loss, perceived or real, in our current socio-economic conditions. Using these three texts as foundational lenses through which to view pop nostalgia, my paper seeks to compare the pop culture climate that made Plastic Love a 2010s internet hit with the one that brought Chuck Berry back to the charts. I believe this comparison can provide some insight into how a shifting socio-political climate can affect popular taste, and elucidate how pop nostalgia might be used to influence conceptions of our present and our future. In Happy Days and Wonder Years, Daniel Marcus argues that throughout the 1970s, the idealized concept of the 50s were upheld as a standard that America should return to, and was used by the rising evangelical right, the Republican Party, and ultimately Ronald Reagan's presidential campaign, culminating in his election in 1980. The themes, symbols, and tropes of the 50s became the primary tool used by right-wing political agents to shape and reshape public memories according to their own needs. Throughout the 2010s, we saw a similar right-wing populist wave supported by notions of nostalgia, We can see this in the Trump campaign's 2016 slogan, "Make America Great Again," which of course was copied directly from Ronald Reagan's 1980 campaign slogan. According to a 2020 study by Hossein Mardi et al., there's a small but growing echo chamber of far-right content consumption on YouTube that reflects broader patterns of news consumption across the web. Daniel Marcus also directly discusses the phenomenon of audiences too young to have direct experience with the decade in question, claiming that personal and group experience may fade as a source of stable identification, replaced by momentary identifications based on media representations of the past. Theorists of postmodernity, such as Frederick Jameson and David Harvey, see this prevalence of unstable, media-driven identification as central to a crisis in historical understanding, the decline of participation in progressive movements, and the discursive power of conservative nostalgia that attempts to recover lost stability. It could be argued, then, that this concurrent rise in the popularity of conservative views and the popular appeal of nostalgia are part of the same belief in a good old days narrative, in, quote, the possibility of a symbolic return to an era that most citizens could not remember in any direct personal way, end quote. However, in this particular case, there's no real evidence that Plastic Love has attracted YouTube's community of right-wing viewers. Unlike many other videos on the site, the comments on Plastic Love seem unusually devoid of political discussion. Rather, the tone of the comments seems more escapist in nature and could indicate that fans of the song are seeking a reprieve from more contemporary American pop music. In his article Good Old Rock and Roll, Auslander discusses the performance of novelty rock group Sha Na Na at Woodstock in 1969 and explains Jeffrey Stokes' definition of their success in performing blatantly inauthentic 1950s style rock and roll as the creation of a music of non-significance, a break from the moral and political freight that rock was bearing. Auslander also acknowledges that this perspective can only be from the vantage point of a culture that perceives itself as having progressed beyond its predecessors. Much like rock music in the 1960s, pop music in the 2010s underwent an evolution, becoming more concerned with issues of social justice. As discussions of social justice and moral responsibility seem increasingly entwined with pop culture, audiences may seek to temporarily escape the weight of these issues. This desire for non-significance becomes all the more pertinent in the case of Plastic Love, a song that is not only from an era of pop culture that didn't seem to concern itself with such heavy issues, at least as we see it today, but is also in a different language from that which most of its audience understands, truly becoming a music without significance, at least to its most ardent English-speaking audience. According to Michael D. Dwyer, pop nostalgia isn't a monolithic form of passive cultural amnesia, but rather a productive and heterogeneous activity evinced by the work of creators and industries towards a variety of cultural and political projects to the present. Therefore, the explanations that pop nostalgia is a result of rising right-wing views, or that it acts as an escape from or backlash to moral, social responsibility, aren't sufficient in explaining why nostalgia becomes popular. Rather, he describes nostalgia as the product of an effective engagement with the present that produces a sense of loss. Or, as he puts it, we find something lacking in our current conditions. During the 1970s, media consumers were not only worn out from the counterculture movement of the 1960s and the continuing Vietnam War, but also faced an oil crisis and a steadily declining economy. Americans were wishing for a return to a prosperous, peaceful, and optimistic period in American history. In other words, the America of the 1950s. A surge in pop nostalgia was the result, a comforting aesthetic of easier times. Dwyer also discusses the importance of impossibility to this kind of engagement with pop nostalgia, asserting that nostalgia arises when the desire for homecoming is simultaneously coupled with a recognition of its impossibility. Young audiences who have only ever known a world affected by the War on Terror and the 2008 global recession may wish to engage with pre-9/11 media as a way of coping with the loss of a certain way of life, a way of life that is exemplified in Plastic Love and inherent to the genre of city pop itself. City pop as a genre was developed out of Japan's economic boom at the time. Sudden economic success, modernization, and industrialization of post-war Japan meant that Japanese audiences had an appetite for urban pop music for those with urban lifestyles. Ideals of leisure and relative wealth are threaded throughout the music. Fantasies of upper middle-class wealth and leisure may especially appeal to Gen Z and millennial teens and young adults who haven't known a similar economic period in their lifetimes. So, as we can see, the reasons why pop nostalgia saturates pop culture are complex and varied. The effective response can be exploited for political gain, escapism, or to imagine how current times could be better, or all of those at once. As technological developments increase access to media of previous eras from all around the world and flatten the past into an easily accessed database, retro aesthetics are anachronistically blended to create new art and media with a number of goals. Understanding what drives the desire for representations and reimaginations of the past helps to navigate and protect from political exploitation of nostalgic sentiment, and it also allows us to use our recreation of the past to envision clearly what our present and our future could look like. In the case of Plastic Love in particular, and the city pop genre more generally, as well as the related internet-born microgenres of future funk and vaporwave, the reasons for their success abroad should also be closely examined. Each of these genres borrows heavily from, or even entirely appropriates, Japanese aesthetics, language, and culture from both the past and the present, but all have largely English-speaking audiences. Unfortunately, those questions are outside of the scope of this paper, but I think further research could reveal important insights regarding the global cultural exchange that takes place as the internet makes cultures of various times and places more accessible.